On the dawn of November 15th, 1315, when fog covered the Alpine valleys like a white shroud, an army of 9,000 men marched through a narrow pass beside Lake Egeri, convinced they would crush a peasant rebellion before midday. They carried the finest armor in Europe, the sturdiest horses, the longest lances. They were the Habsburgs, lords of Austria, and they believed no mountain shepherd could stop them. But on the rocky heights surrounding the path, 1,500 men waited in absolute silence, peasants with axes, shepherds with crossbows, men who knew every stone, every curve, every deadly trap the mountain could offer. And when the Austrian column entered completely into the pass, the sky collapsed upon them. Enormous rocks rolled downhill like avalanches of death. Giant logs crushed entire ranks. Screams tore through the frozen air. Horses plunged toward the Black Lake. Shining armor disappeared beneath tons of stone and mud. The waters of Egeri turned red. And when the sun finally pierced the fog, the most powerful army in Central Europe lay shattered at the bottom of a Swiss valley. That day, a handful of peasants had stopped an empire, and the echo of that morning would resound through the centuries, reminding the world that freedom, when defended on the right ground, can crush even the heaviest chains. In the early 14th century, Central Europe was a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and territories in constant dispute. Since the days of Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire had governed much of these lands, but its power had fragmented among dozens of princes and nobles who competed fiercely for territory and influence. Among these nobles, none was more ambitious than the House of Habsburg. From their castle in the hills of Switzerland, the Habsburgs had systematically expanded their domain through strategic marriages, political alliances, and military conquests. In 1282, Rudolf of Habsburg had been elected King of Germany, a victory that catapulted the family toward the center of European power. His descendants dreamed of converting their scattered possessions into a unified and powerful kingdom that could rival France and England. But there was an obstacle. In the heart of the Alps, 3 small valleys had refused to bow before Habsburg power. Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, 3 communities of shepherds, peasants, and mountain folk who had signed a pact of mutual aid in August of 1291. It was not a kingdom. It was not even a standing army. It was simply an agreement among free people who refused to surrender their autonomy to distant feudal lords. For the Habsburgs, this resistance was intolerable. The 3 valleys controlled the strategic St. Gotthard Pass, a vital trade route connecting northern Europe with Italy. Whoever controlled that pass controlled the flow of gold, goods, and military power through the Alps. More importantly, allowing simple peasants to defy aristocratic authority set a dangerous precedent. If these mountain folk could govern themselves, what would prevent other territories from doing the same? For decades, the Habsburgs had attempted to subdue the Swiss Confederates through oppressive taxes, military garrisons, and tyrannical governors. Austrian bailiffs were sent to the valleys with orders to break their spirit of independence. Lands were confiscated, arbitrary fines were imposed. Those who dared protest were imprisoned. But each act of oppression only hardened the resistance. The peasants of the valleys were not professional warriors, but they knew something no Austrian knight could learn on a training field. They knew the mountains. They knew how fog moved through valleys. They knew where ice made paths slippery. They knew which cliffs had loose rocks ready to fall with a push. Later legends would speak of William Tell, the crossbowman who shot an arrow through an apple atop his son's head and then killed the tyrant Gessler. Truth or myth, the story captured something real. A spirit of resistance that refused to be extinguished. By 1315, Habsburg patience had run out. Leopold of Austria, brother of Duke Frederick the Fair, received orders to definitively crush the mountain rebels. The campaign would be swift, brutal, exemplary. He assembled an impressive army, knights in full armor from the finest families of Austria and Swabia, men-at-arms, with years of combat experience, archers and crossbowmen, infantry trained in battle formations. Nearly 9,000 soldiers in total, a force 5 or 6 times larger than anything the Confederates could gather. Preparations began in autumn. Nobles received the summons. Armorers worked day and night, sharpening swords and repairing breastplates. Stables filled with war horses, enormous animals bred specifically to charge into battle with armored riders upon them. In the taverns of Zug and Lucerne, soldiers toasted an easy victory. They spoke of burning villages, of hanging rebel leaders, of finally teaching these peasants their place in the natural order of the world. The plan was simple, but devastating. The army would march south from Zug, traverse the shores of Lake Egeri, and enter directly into the heart of Schwyz territory. From there, they would crush any resistance valley by valley until nothing remained except submission. Leopold did not anticipate a battle. He anticipated a one-sided massacre. In his mind, the war was already won. Only the formality of marching there and claiming victory remained. But in the mountains, other men were making their own preparations, and their plan did not involve facing the Habsburgs in open field. It involved turning the mountain itself into a weapon. Werner Stauffacher of Schwyz stood atop a rocky ridge, observing the narrow path that snaked beside Lake Egeri. He was a man of about 50 years, face weathered by alpine wind, hands calloused by decades of farm work. He was not a lord, he was not a knight. He was a peasant who had been chosen by his community to lead their defense. Beside him stood the other leaders from the 3 valleys, Arnold von Melchthal of Unterwalden, whose father had been blinded by an Austrian bailiff for refusing to surrender his best ox, Walter Fürst of Uri, wise elder, whose quiet determination inspired confidence even in the darkest moments. These men had no noble titles. They had no heraldic coats of arms. They only had the trust of their neighbors and intimate knowledge of the terrain where they had been born. For weeks, Swiss spies had tracked Austrian movements. Messengers ran along mountain paths no armored rider could follow, carrying information about enemy army size, their march route, the speed of their advance. When it became clear Leopold planned to attack through the Morgarten pass, Stauffacher knew exactly what to do. The pass was perfect for an ambush, a narrow path trapped between the steep slopes of Mount Figlenfluh on one side and the deep waters of Lake Egeri on the other. In some places, the road was barely wide enough for 3 horses to pass side by side. There was no room to maneuver. There was no room to deploy battle formations. It was a tunnel of death waiting to close upon anyone arrogant enough to enter. Preparations began in absolute secrecy. By night, the mountain folk climbed to the heights above the pass, carrying enormous logs, rocks the size of a man, sharpened stones. They placed them carefully in strategic positions, balanced at the edge of steep precipices, ready to be pushed with a single signal. Shallow trenches were dug, where men could hide completely invisible from below. Trees were partially cut, so they could be quickly felled, blocking sections of the path. Every detail was meticulously planned. The Swiss had no armor. Their weapons were axes, clubs, halberds, agricultural tools converted into instruments of war. Some had crossbows, weapons a peasant could learn to use effectively within weeks. There was no Swiss cavalry. There were no aristocrats in full armor. Only 1,500 men determined to defend their homes, using the only resource they had in abundance, the mountain itself. Stauffacher gathered his men the night before the expected battle. They spoke beside small fires hidden in hollows where light could not be seen from afar. His speech was simple, direct, without the flowery rhetoric of nobles. Tomorrow they come to take everything we have, our lands, our freedom, our lives. We cannot defeat them in open field, but here, in these valleys, the mountain fights for us. Let them enter the trap, then show them what it means to fight against men defending their home. No one slept that night. Men checked their weapons, sharpened blades, prayed to saints whose names they barely knew. Some wrote farewell letters to their families, though few could read or write. Others simply sat in silence, listening to wind blow through alpine peaks, wondering if they would see another dawn. Before dawn, they moved to their positions. Like ghosts, they climbed goat paths toward the heights above the pass. They concealed themselves behind rocks, beneath branches, inside cracks in the mountainside, completely invisible, completely silent, waiting. Below, Lake Ageri reflected the first grayish light of sky. Fog coiled over the water like white smoke, and then they heard the sound. Distant at first, then growing louder. The metallic jingling of armor, the heavy thudding of thousands of feet, the snorting of horses, the creaking of wagon wheels. The Habsburg army was arriving. Stauffacher raised his hand, signaled that no one should move, that no one should breathe too loudly. A single mistake now, and the ambush would be ruined. The Austrians had to enter completely into the pass. They had to be so deeply inside the trap that there was no escape. Then, only then, would the mountain fall upon them. The Austrian army entered the Morgarten Pass like an iron serpent. In the vanguard rode knights in full armor, their helms gleaming dimly in morning light, lances raised like a forest of steel. Behind them, endless rows of infantry marched in formation, archers with longbows, men-at-arms with swords and shields, carts pulled by oxen loaded with provisions and siege equipment. The column stretched for more than a kilometer, winding slowly along the narrow path between mountain and lake. Leopold of Austria rode near the front, surrounded by his most experienced officers. His armor had been polished to brilliance. His cloak billowed in the cold wind. He looked toward the fog-covered heights with slight unease, but dismissed it. The Swiss peasants were cowards, surely. They had probably already fled deeper into the mountains. This would be a long walk, followed by burning, empty villages. Nothing more. The path narrowed even further. To his left, the slope of Mount Figlenfluh rose almost vertically, covered with twisted pines and loose rocks. To his right, Lake Ageri waited black and deep. The army compressed into an increasingly narrow line. The horses grew nervous, sensing something their riders could not see. Then the first log fell. An enormous pine, partially cut the night before, was pushed from above. It fell like a wooden lightning bolt, spinning and crushing through lower branches before crashing into the middle of the Austrian vanguard. Horses screamed, riders were thrown from their mounts. Before anyone could react, the world exploded. From every slope, from every precipice, from every high point of the pass, the Swiss pushed their weapons. Massive rocks rolled downhill, gaining monstrous speed. Each weighed hundreds of kilos. Where they struck, they crushed everything in their path. Plate armor crumpled, like parchment. Bones shattered, men disappeared beneath avalanches of stone. More logs fell, these launched at calculated angles to strike where the column was densest. The sound was deafening. The crash of wood against metal, screams of men and animals, the dull roar of rolling rocks. The Austrian formation disintegrated instantly. There was no room to maneuver. There was no room to retreat. The path behind them was blocked by fallen trees. The path ahead disappeared beneath landslides. Horses, terrified by chaos, leaped toward the lake, dragging their armored riders with them. The armor that should have protected them became steel coffins. Men sank immediately, drowning in the frozen waters of Ageri without hope of salvation. And then the Swiss charged. From the heights, they descended like wolves, halberds swinging, axes cutting, clubs crushing. They moved with terrible efficiency, attacking where armor was weakest, at the joints, under the arms, behind the knees. They did not seek glory. They sought survival. Stauffacher was in the middle of the attack, his axe raised, shouting orders barely heard over the chaos. He did not fight like a knight. He fought like a butcher, quick, brutal, without wasted movement. Around him, peasants who, had never seen real battle-killed professional warriors because the terrain was theirs, because surprise was absolute, because they had no other choice. A group of Austrian knights tried to mount a counter-offensive. They gathered in a small clearing where the path widened slightly, forming a circle with lances pointing outward. For a moment it seemed they might hold. Then a wave of smaller rocks, the size of human heads, rained upon them from above. Swiss crossbowmen loosed volley after volley from hidden positions. And when the formation broke, men with halberds rushed forward, their pole weapons designed specifically to bring down heavily armored horsemen. The battle became massacre. The Austrians could not see their enemies until it was too late. The fog, ally of the Swiss, concealed movements and positions. Every shadow could be an attacker. Every rock could be about to roll. Panic spread faster than fire. Men threw down their weapons and ran, only to slip in blood and mud, falling beneath the feet of their own comrades. Leopold shouted orders no one could hear. He tried to rally his best knights for a coordinated counterattack, but communication was impossible. Horns could not be heard over the screaming. Standards disappeared in smoke and mist. His own horse was struck by a flying stone, limping dangerously close to the edge of the path above the lake. Veteran officers who had fought in dozens of battles stared in absolute horror. This was not war. This was annihilation. An Austrian nobleman, recognizable by his golden heraldic shield, tried to run uphill toward the attackers. He climbed barely 3 meters before a halberd hooked him by the neck and dragged him back down. His armor rang like bells as he rolled over the rocks. Others tried to swim across the lake toward safety. Most drowned before reaching halfway. Those who made it to the far shore collapsed exhausted, too weak to do anything except shiver on the rocky bank. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. By the time the sun finally burned through the morning fog, the Morgarten pass had transformed into an open grave. Bodies lay piled 3 deep in some places. Broken armor gleamed in the new light. Fallen standards floated in the red-stained lake. The surviving Austrians, barely a third of the original army, fled in total disorder. They ran back, along the road they had come, throwing away weapons and armor to move faster. Some did not stop until reaching Zug. Others ran all the way to Austria. All carried with them the same terrifying story. The mountains had devoured the Habsburg army. Peasants had defeated knights. The impossible had happened. On the battlefield, the Swiss walked among the dead. Some searched for weapons and armor they could use. Others simply sat, too exhausted to move, barely believing they were still alive. Stauffacher stood on a rocky outcrop, looking toward the valley where the army that should have crushed them now lay shattered. Blood stained his clothes. His axe was notched from use, but he was alive. His people were alive. And in that moment, something changed. They were no longer just 3 valleys of peasants living at the margins of history. They were something new, something Europe had never seen before, a confederation of free men who had proven that courage and terrain could defeat even the greatest feudal power. When silence finally fell over Morgarten, it was a silence deeper than anything the survivors had known. The Alpine wind blew softly, carrying the smell of blood and iron. The waters of Lake Ageri lapped at the rocky shore, dragging remnants of standards and armor toward its dark depths. In the pass, 1,500 men stood among their enemies dead, barely able to comprehend what they had done. There were no cheers. There was no celebration. Only the heavy silence of men who had crossed a threshold and knew their lives and the lives of their descendants would never be the same. Stauffacher walked slowly through the battlefield, stopping beside each fallen man from his own people. He had lost friends that morning, neighbors with whom he had shared beer and bread. But Swiss losses were astonishingly small, perhaps 50 men compared to thousands of Austrians. The disproportion was so extreme it seemed a miracle. Yet he knew the truth. It was not a miracle. It was preparation. It was knowledge of terrain. It was the desperate will of men fighting for everything they loved. When afternoon came, preparations began for burials. The Swiss dead were carried back to their valleys, where they would be buried in consecrated ground, with prayers from their families. The Austrian dead were too numerous to bury individually. Great pyres were built in clearings. Outside the pass, for days afterwards, smoke rose toward the alpine sky, a dark column visible from kilometers away, a marker of where an empire had stumbled. News of the defeat spread like fire in dry straw. In Zug, survivors arrived wild-eyed, bloodied, speaking of mountains that collapsed and peasants who fought like demons. In Lucerne, merchants exchanged nervous glances, wondering if their own cities would be next to feel Habsburg wrath or Confederate ferocity. In Vienna, when news reached Leopold, who had managed to escape the massacre, the Duke sat in silence for hours. His pride was shattered, his reputation ruined. He had marched with 9,000 men to crush a peasant rebellion and barely escaped with his life. Court chroniclers would try to minimize the defeat later, blaming terrain, weather, bad luck. But the truth was impossible to hide. The Habsburgs, the most powerful noble family in the Holy Roman Empire, had been humiliated by shepherds and farmers. The impact of Morgarten resonated far beyond the Swiss mountains. Throughout Europe, the story was told in taverns and marketplaces. Serfs whispered it in fields. Nobles discussed it uneasily in their halls. For the first time in centuries, peasants had defeated aristocratic cavalry in open battle. Not through superior numbers, not through advanced technology. Through cunning, courage, and absolute refusal to bow. For the three forest valleys, Morgarten was the founding moment. Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden renewed their pact with renewed fervor. It was no longer simply an agreement of defensive mutual aid. It was a declaration that they existed as an independent political entity, a confederation that recognized no lord except itself. In December 1315, barely weeks after the battle, representatives of the three cantons gathered in Brunnen, a village beside Lake Lucerne. There, they signed a treaty known as the Pact of Brunnen, formalizing their eternal alliance. The document was simple, written in Latin on rough parchment. It promised mutual aid against all enemies, protection of each community's rights, and rejection of any judge or lord imposed from outside. It was, in essence, a declaration of independence 7 centuries before that concept became norm. The Habsburgs never forgave. For generations, they tried to break the Swiss Confederation. They sent more armies, imposed economic blockades, fomented internal divisions. But Morgarten had taught the Swiss something they would never forget. Their freedom had to be constantly defended, and they could defend it if they remained united. More cantons joined the Confederation over time. Lucerne in 1332, Zurich in 1351, Glarus and Zug shortly after. Each brought its own strengths: wealthy trading cities, productive agricultural valleys, strategic mountain passes. Slowly, the Confederation grew from 3 valleys to 13 cantons, the Helvetic Confederation that would eventually become modern Switzerland. Victory at Morgarten also established the Swiss military reputation that would last centuries. Their infantry tactics, especially the use of halberds and pikes in dense formations, became legendary. In future decades, Swiss pike formations would dominate European battlefields. Kings and princes would pay fortunes to hire Swiss mercenaries, considered the best infantry soldiers in Europe. That tradition, born in the bloody mud of Morgarten, would continue into the modern era. But perhaps the deepest legacy was not military or political, it was philosophical. Morgarten demonstrated that freedom was not a gift bestowed by nobles or kings. It was something ordinary people could take and hold for themselves. In an age where almost everyone was expected to serve a lord, swear allegiance to a duke, kneel before an emperor, the Swiss peasants proved another path was possible. They could govern themselves. They could choose their own leaders. They could live under laws they themselves had created. That idea, so radical for the 14th century, would resonate through the following centuries, inspiring revolutions, democratic movements, liberation struggles on continents that did not even know existed in 1315. And it all began in a narrow alpine pass, where 1,500 men refused to kneel. The years passed. The men who fought at Morgarten grew old, telling their stories to sons and grandsons who listened in wonder. Stauffacher lived to old age, never seeking titles or rewards, dying as he had lived, a free peasant in a free land. Trees grew again over the battlefield scars, grass covered the bloodstains, Lake Egeri returned to its deep blue, keeping its secrets beneath cold waves. But memory never faded. Each generation of Swiss learned the story. They learned that when odds seemed impossible, when the enemy seemed invincible, courage and the right terrain could change destiny. They learned that freedom demanded a price, and that price had to be paid again and again by those who refused to live on their knees. In the centuries that followed, Switzerland would become synonymous with independence. While empires rose and fell around it, the Alpine Confederation remained neutral, impregnable, free. Napoleon would briefly conquer it, but even his empire could not hold it for long. World wars would ravage Europe, but the Swiss mountains remained intact, a haven of peace surrounded by chaos. All of this has its roots in that November morning. In 1315, when unarmored peasants proved that tyranny, no matter how powerful, could be defeated. Today, if you visit the Morgarten Pass, you will find a simple monument. A stone chapel stands near where the ambush occurred. Plaques commemorate the men who fought and died there. But the real monument is not stone. It is the nation they created, a nation built not by kings or conquerors, but by ordinary people who refused to surrender to their fate. Morgarten taught the world a lesson that resonates even today. That numbers alone do not win wars, that technology alone does not ensure victory. That power, no matter how great, can be defeated by those who fight for something larger than themselves. And on quiet nights, when wind blows through alpine peaks, you can almost hear it, the echo of that ancient morning, the cry of free men defending their land, the roar of rocks rolling downhill, the splash of armored riders falling into frozen waters, and the silence that followed when an empire learned that some mountains and some people can never be conquered.